All right, that was testimony from the use of force expert there in Chicago. We're also monitoring the Brad Fields case. Closing arguments have just begun in that case. Go to lawandcrime.com to get updates on that. Here in studio with me, lawyer extraordinaire, and according to your website, a pretty good cook, Elura Nanos.
How you doing, Vincent?
Good, good. Hey, we just heard this testimony from this use of force expert. He talked about imminent threat when you're using deadly force, serious bodily injury or death. He also mentioned fleeing felon rule, which says you can use deadly force to stop a suspect that may be a threat to the public. But one key part of his testimony I saw there was he said it didn't meet the assessment to justify deadly force, talking about the shooting of Laquan McDonald. What say you?
You know, I have to agree with him, at least based on what I know. And you know, what I know is what the public knows, which is I've seen that tape. I wasn't there. You know, maybe we'll hear on the defense that there is some other information that, you know, maybe we couldn't tell from just looking at that perspective in the tape. Certainly open to hear that. But from what I see right now, what it's missing from what I see is the imminence. You know, was there a risk? This guy had a knife. Yeah, there was maybe a risk. Was that risk imminent? Was it going to happen right now? I don't know that. You know, we were talking a little bit about the fleeing felon rule. And the fleeing felon rule, while it's been around a long time, the Supreme Court has said for the last many years that the force has to be necessary to prevent the escape. And I don't know that's established here.
Yeah, I don't know. It's definitely questionable whether this force was imminent there. You can see on your screen part of that dash cam footage. We're going to take a quick break. We have more testimony from this use of force expert in the Jason Van Dyke case in Chicago. Laquan McDonald was shot 16 times. Stay tuned. We will be right back. Okay, so there you have it. Yuri Patrick, the use of force expert, has said several times, because he's been asked by the prosecution, was that deadly force justified? He said several times no. And Elura, you and I were talking. We were looking at this footage. You can see it there on the screen. You see the fence that is to the right of Laquan. You see he would have to go down a block or two to get to a cross street where he could actually start running away from police officers, unless we assume he would jump the fence. But I see what the use of force expert Yuri Patrick is saying here. There was no public, there were no pedestrians, there was nothing to suggest that he could have been an imminent threat to someone just walking down the street with that knife. So I think that's what the big issue here is in this case. Was he a threat not only to Van Dyke or the other officers, but to anyone in the public?
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'll tell you, you know, it's easy to gloss over this word necessary. You know, that's the standard for use of force. Was it necessary to prevent him from fleeing? Was it necessary to protect himself and others? And, you know, in the law, when we use the word necessary in a number of contexts, it is the strictest word. It's not just thrown around. Necessary in legal standards really means there is no other way to accomplish this goal. It's either this or nothing. And in this situation, it's not that it needed to have been convenient or helpful or useful to shoot him in order to protect the public. It had to be the only way to protect the public, the only way to prevent him from fleeing. And I just don't see that, because at a minimum, they could have shot him in the foot. That would have stopped him from getting away. That's an alternative that I came up with right there.
Well, in defense, officers are not trained to shoot in the foot. They're trained to shoot center mass and to eliminate the threat. We have much more to come in this Jason Van Dyke trial in Chicago. Laquan McDonald was shot 16 times while he was armed with a knife. Stay tuned to the Law and Crime. All right, we're still hearing testimony there from Yuri Patrick, use of force expert. Elura, we heard his testimony, but I know the defense, you know, they're going to hammer back on this and still drive the fact that Laquan posed a threat to either Jason Van Dyke, the other officers, or even the public. I don't see it. You know, I've been in those situations. My days in policing, I've probably pulled my gun 100 times. Never pulled the trigger once, because it's based on what I believe to be reasonable at that time. So do you think maybe Van Dyke was maybe acting within what he thought was the law, especially the fleeing felon part? Do you think he was acting in what he believed to be the law at that time?
I think that is certainly a possibility, and I'll say this. Whether or not Van Dyke believed he was acting legally is actually not relevant at all. What's relevant is whether he actually acted legally or illegally.
Right.
But I think that that's an important point. And one of the things that this brings up to me is we have this expert talking about expert ideas about what would be appropriate for use of force. But really, this is not a case where we really need expert testimony. This is a case where we need to know what the officer subjectively was feeling in the moment. Because that's what it comes down to. If he really believed that he was facing deadly force, or he really believed he needed to shoot this guy to stop other damage, and the jury thinks that that was reasonable, then that's enough. So really, this isn't a scientific case.
Right.
This is a case where we need to know, what did this guy actually believe in that moment, and what do we think as a society about what he thought? Was it reasonable or not?
Okay, so to that point, do you think that Van Dyke will take the stand in his own defense here? I think he has to, in my opinion.
I think he has to.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is, I doubt very much that Van Dyke wanted to murder this man.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, I think that at worst, this was a bad error in police judgment. But he certainly didn't set out to do this. So he should want to tell his side of the story. He should want to explain why in that moment this was what he felt the right thing to do was. He is a trained police officer, and I think his perspective is very, very important to this. So we'll have to see what he says.
Yeah, I think it's key for him to take the stand in his own defense as this goes on. We'll have more testimony here in the Jason Van Dyke case in Chicago. Laquan McDonald was shot 16 times back in 2014. Stay tuned to the Law and Crime Network. All right, we're listening to cross-examination of the use of force expert Yuri Patrick. Laura, a few key points here, right? So in the cross, the defense brought up the knife being a deadly weapon, which it is. It's an edge weapon. And the 21-foot rule. I believe the defense said 20 feet here. But basically, for the viewers that don't know, typically if someone's within 21 feet, they can actually stab you quicker than you could draw your weapon. So I see where he's going here. But the problem, the officer already had his weapon drawn. It was already at the low ready. So we can't say he would have to unholster his weapon, aim it on target before shooting. So I think I see where he's going here, but I don't think it's actually going to affect the outcome of what the jury may think in this.
I really agree with you, Vincent. I think that 21-foot training rule is an important thing on the defense, for the defense to bring up, because, you know, to us at home, it certainly sounds like 20 feet, 21 feet. That seems like a huge distance. But when you think about it, that police are trained, hey, that's only a couple of steps. That is a big deal, and that's an important point for the defense to have made. I agree with you. I don't know how effective it's going to be just in the totality here. So we're going to have to wait and see.
Absolutely. All right, we'll have more of this testimony from Yuri Patrick. He's on cross-examination right now in the Jason Van Dyke trial in Chicago, Illinois. Stay tuned to the Law and Crime Network. You don't want to miss anything. We'll be right back. All right, Yuri Patrick is still on the stand during cross-examination. He's a use of force expert talking about the shooting death of Laquan McDonald. Laura, we were talking during this testimony about how this testimony in this line of questioning by the defense is actually reasonable because it's staying within the law and it's actually staying within the use of force continuum, the use of force policies for that department. So do you think, listening to this, and of course Yuri's giving honest answers based on his expertise, do you think that'll play heavily into the jury's decision? Because let's keep in mind, Van Dyke didn't wake up that morning with the intent to go find Laquan McDonald and kill him. So it's not your typical murder. It's this officer was on the scene because of the incident that happened prior to that. So you think that'll weigh on the jury?
I do. I actually think that this cross-examination is taking some direct testimony that was actually very helpful to the prosecution. The witness said, you know, yes, in my opinion, the shooting was a bad shooting, which, you know, is the best evidence that you could hope for from an expert witness and exactly the reason why he was called. And now the defense, in actually doing a not so aggressive cross-examination, not discrediting him really, not attacking him at all, is actually muddying it significantly, because now you have a defense attorney who has his own law enforcement background. asking good, reasonable questions of this witness. The witness is giving answers that support the defense, and basically we're walking away with, hey, this is complicated, which is something that you certainly know. Anyone familiar with law enforcement knows these are complicated decisions. I actually think that the value of this witness is significantly diminished by this cross-examination.
Absolutely. And he testified that there was cases where a person with a knife that has been shot has actually stabbed at police. We'll have more of this testimony in the Jason Van Dyke trial in Chicago. Stay tuned. Okay, you're listening to closing arguments in the penalty phase of Cody Lott. That's prosecutor Ron Poole. And one of the things he said, no conscience. And he's asking for life in this case. Laura, I got to ask you, though, we talked about this sentencing. Between 5 and 99 years. That's kind of a weird configuration to me, especially in a state that has the death penalty. What do you make of this whole 5 to 99 years?
I think it actually makes it pretty difficult for the jury, because what you have is on the minimal end, it's so low as if almost not to make sense for a murder. And then on the maximum end, it's obviously so high that it exceeds the defendant's lifespan. So they're basically left with do whatever you want, do almost nothing, do more than you possibly could need. It's a lot of discretion given to the jury, and I think that Mr. Poole, the prosecutor here, is doing really an excellent job, from a prosecution standpoint, of bringing all this emotion into it. And as a former prosecutor myself, I really like what he's doing, talking about timing. He's talking about the idea of years, that this won't go away in years for these victims, that, it's not something that is going to be different in a few years. And I think that that's very smart and really plays into, making that point to the jury, hey, this needs a lot of years, not just a few. Yeah,
absolutely. And to what he said, like, Michaela won't be able to walk home from school without ever thinking about that. Even when she gets older and goes to college, she'll always think about that. This is Cody Lott. Again, he was convicted yesterday for the murder of 13-year-old Lauren Ledendazal. I'm sorry about that. And Michaela Smith. They were both 13. Michaela survived, but a very tragic case. We'll have more of that closing arguments in the penalty phase when we return on the Law and Crime Network. All right, we've been listening to Jose Torres there on the stand there in the Jason Van Dyke murder trial. He's testifying that he saw Laquan McDonald just prior to the shooting and what led to that shooting. Still with me, Elura Nanos. Elura, one of the questions that the prosecutor asked, was Laquan McDonald making threatening movements towards the police? And, of course, the defense immediately objected. And the only thing I can think about is maybe the defense is saying, hey, this guy is a civilian. He's not trained on use of force. He's not trained on what's threatening. And it wasn't his perception of what was going on in that exact moment. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, I don't know exactly the reason why he was objecting. He may be preserving that issue for an appeal, should something come of it. But we have two different things going on here. It's possible that the point that the defense attorney is trying to make is, hey, as you said, hey, you are not an expert. You don't really know what threatening means. But I'll say, legally speaking, he doesn't have to be an expert. Threatening movements are something that a lay witness is absolutely qualified to testify about. On the other hand, if the argument there is this is objectionable and inadmissible because this guy cannot testify to how another person felt, then that's a good objection. So I think that he's maybe doing it for that reason, because that's really a more legally sound reason. And to say that he's in no position to testify about how threatened or not threatened the cop felt during that time.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think that would be reasonable.
Yeah, and I think it'll come down to that. And to your point, yeah, a layperson could say, hey, I believe this person was intoxicated based on what I observed their movements to be, or something like that.
Right.
So, yeah, I definitely get that. We expect Jose Torres will still be on the stand in the Jason Van Dyke murder trial at the other end of this break. You don't want to miss it. Laquan McDonald was shot 16 times by a Chicago police officer back in 2014. He is on trial right now for murder. Stay tuned to the Law and Crime Network.